Hello again, railroaders, and welcome back to my hometown rails. Today's video is a full-length history on the CSX Brooksville Subdivision from Tampa to Brooksville. So sit back and enjoy CSX 101, the Brooksville Subdivision, Seaboard's Backdoor Mainline. Okay, let's wind back about 200 years into 1824. The same year that Florida was accepted into statehood, the settlement of Tampa had just begun with Fort Brooke, established in 1824 to oversee the Seminoles. Fast forward 60 years and Henry B. Plant's South Florida Railroad has arrived in 1884 and stimulated population growth and new industry. In 1892, Scottish businessman Hugh McFarland founded West Tampa, a new community across the Hillsborough River that sought to attract more cigar factories and workers. By 1900, the town had already one of the largest populations in Florida, mostly Cubans involved in the cigar industry. People up north were beginning to long for the warm and tropical climate of South Florida and the extensive lumber industry in Central and North Florida. With cars being a new and expensive phenomenon, steam passenger trains were still the main form of transportation for all of these new citizens. With a main line into Tampa Union Station built and now operational, the population in the general area of Tampa is growing at a quickening rate. With this in mind, the Brooksville and Hudson Railroad, owned by Arapeka Sawmills, has just begun construction on the line from the newly established settlement of Brooksville south to Vevay Junction. 5 years later, in 1907, the Brooksville and Hudson Railroad was bought by the Tampa Northern. The Tampa Northern then built track from Tampa to Vevay and rebuilt the Brooksville and Hudson Railroad from there to Brooksville. The line was completed in 1908. At about the same time, there were many railroad lines north of Tampa. Coming north out of Tampa, the Tampa Northern would first join with the Tampa and Gulf Coast Railroad, which would later be Seaboard trackage that continued from Sulphur Springs Junction to St. Petersburg. Then into the small Nowitney Yard, where a post office and a small platform would welcome northbound trains or southbound trains into or out of Lutz. The station platform would usually see less than 20 people on and off each day, but the post office would receive cars for loading onto small trucks. Into Lutz, the Tampa Northern would again join with the Tampa and Gulf Coast Railroad. Presently, Lutz Lake Fern Road is the exact location of this intersecting line. Right at Lutz Junction, trains could either continue straight and north to Brooksville or use a leg of the Y to head westbound into Odessa, Newport Richey, Elfers, and finally Tarpon Springs. This line would be named the Odessa Sub, which would turn south at Tarpon Springs and join the Clearwater Line at Palm Harbor Junction. All these lines together would create a railroad square of North Tampa. About 5 miles north of Lutz is Drexel. This is where the narrow-gauge Orange Belt Railroad, later the ACL, would cross at grade on its way from Clearwater to Sanford. Stations along this line like Odessa and Keystone Park would be rebuilt to handle the new 57-inch width track. Finally, into Brooksville, the line would join the Florida Southern's Brooksville branch out of Ocala via Dunellen and Crystal River. Between the handful of passenger and freight trains each day, the Tampa Northern Tampa to Brooksville, Maine became a bit of a hotspot. But all this would change when in 1912 the Seaboard Airline bought the Tampa Northern's Brooksville line and the small Hooker's Point lead into Port Tampa. At its greatest extent, the Brooksville subdivision ended as far north as Waldo, about 45 miles north of Ocala. Track from Waldo to Archer was built in 1861 by the Florida Railroad, which also continued from Archer to Cedar Key at the time. The Seaboard Airline bought the Florida Railroad network in 1900, and in 1911 the line was extended south of Earlybird into Inverness. The extension from Earlybird to Inverness ran closely parallel to the Atlantic Coastline's Lakeland to High Springs route. In 1925, the Brooksville and Inverness Railway, a Seaboard subsidiary, was built connecting Inverness with the former Tampa Northern Railroad in Brooksville. This would create an additional freight route from North Florida to Tampa Bay, as an alternative to the Seaboard main line. After track from Archer to Cedar Key was abandoned in 1932, the full line from Waldo to Sulphur Springs was designated the Brooksville Subdivision. By 1940, the Seaboard was running a daily through freight round trip on the line. There had always been lumber mills along the line, but with the Tampa area growing each day, many industries decided to build just north of Tampa along the Brooksville sub. It was cheaper land along with a newly built main line, and it was easier to get in and out of Tampa from the north rather than from the south that crosses all the ports and more railroad lines. The 1950s would be the Brooksville Sub's heyday, with numerous passenger trains and freight movements daily. Unfortunately, things would change mighty quickly for the flourishing right-of-way, as in 1967, the Seaboard Airline became the Seaboard Coastline after merging with their former rival, the Atlantic Coastline Railroad. In the combined network, the full line was largely redundant due to the Atlantic Coastline's railroad near parallel route, as well as its own main line to Tampa via Orlando, Lakeland, and Sanford. Between the S line, the A line, and now the Brooksville sub, there was too much trackage for too little business. After the surge in rail networking in the early 1930s, it would only take railroads a couple of decades to realize they had overbuilt. The Seaboard Coastline abandoned the Brooksville Subdivision between Waldo and Brooksville in the 1970s, as with industry dropping and major track maintenance needed, the SEL decided it would simply be too much to lose. Presently, the line ends near the Brocco Quarry just north of Brooksville. Despite the abandonment, the line's SR milepost numbers remain as they did when the full line was intact. In 1980, the Seaboard Coastline's parent company merged with the Chessie system, creating the CSX Corporation. The CSX Corporation initially operated the Chessie and Seaboard systems separately until in 1986, they were merged all together into CSX Transportation. By this time, the Brooksville sub would see a handful of freight trains a week and a few loaded coal trains each month. Remember, trains were a lot shorter then, which meant more of them. Between the giant coal-fired CEMEX plant established in 1984, the Florida Crushed Stone Company from 1961, and the many more local industries that were built along this line, Brooksville and the areas around it still had some income, and in 1990, CSX rebuilt the majority of the line from Vevay Junction into Brooksville. This is why the trackage from Tampa to Lutz is stamped in 1943, and not 1990 like the rest of it. But instead of just leaving our local line in the dust of history, let's see how CSX in 2021 operates this line in the midst of a pandemic recovery and the abolition of precision scheduled railroading. Let's start at the beginning, or the terminus of this line, Tampa and the ex-Seaboard's Yeoman Yard. Here at TN, named after one of CSX's early predecessors, the Tampa Northern, we can see a railroad diamond. This is where the ACL's main line into Tampa Union Station in the Old Port crossed the Seaboard's Clearwater Main. Now, before any historians have a fit, this is the Clearwater sub, but without this 5-mile stretch of trackage between Sulphur Springs and Tampa, the Brooksville sub and all of its industry would lead to nowhere. This video of a Brooksville local is courtesy of Ken Ramp Jr. from 2018, only about a year before that little interlocking tower named TN was demolished. Moving north about 2 miles, we see a Tuesday night local, 0728. The designated Brooksville job ID cruised through Parker Siding. This siding was once part of a double-track main from Sulphur Springs to TN, but a few detrimental storms and procrastinated years of maintenance on the second track has created 2 sidings, Parker and Pasco. Here's an empty coal train headed southbound out of the CEMEX Brooksville cement plant. Notice the 2 tracks in this shot. This is Pasco Siding, just north of Bush Boulevard. The track that this T802 is on leads to Brooksville, and the track on the right leads timetable north but physically west into Clearwater and St. Petersburg. Just past the north end of Pasco Siding, the beginning of the Brooksville sub, lies ACL's Hillsborough Spur. Once a 4-mile branch into downtown Temple Terrace, the spur has only Yuengling Brewery to serve now. The small runaround track is located just off the Brooksville Main, and in this case is being used for the reason it was built, running the locomotive around the train to shove into the plant. Yuengling gets about 3 shipments of 5 to 8 loaded malt cars a week, with empties being pulled out in the same operation. Just a few blocks north of the spur is Fletcher Avenue, where Now Whitney Yard once stood. Now all that still remains is some sporadic ballast and a DTC N-yard block sign. However, there still is industry around, that being UFP of Tampa, a wood supplier that receives loaded center beams and flat cars up to 4 times a week. History still abides at Skipper Road, the last crossing until Lutz. Notice the obscure gate setup here. Original aluminum cantilevers for 8-inch gauge crossing signals, and a flashing yellow light with a burnt out no turn on red sign. This is a product of the SEL days. These crossings have probably been here since the late 60s or early 70s, almost 50 years or more to today, working hard for now a Class 1 railroad. Skipping north again, we get to the exact spot of where the Tampa and Gulf Coast main line to Odessa, Tarpon Springs, and Alpha is joined with the Tampa Northern. The TN's tracks are obviously still in place and operational, but the only thing left at the old TGC is a small rendition of a depot here from 1902, painted Seaboard style, and Lutz Lake Fern Road. Underneath this asphalt and pavement is the remains of a once busy line straight to the west coast and the stunning beaches of the Gulf. On this rainy evening, we see a fairly uncommon sight of 6-axle power clearing the depot. The ES40 DC in the lead, being numbered 5202, was built in July of 2005. The main industry in Lutz is Tibbetts Lumber. I believe this spur is only used once, maybe twice a week, to deliver anywhere from 1 boxcar to 5 center beams, all loaded with lumber from up north. Just before twilight on a Sunday night, we can see 0728 shoving a loaded center beam into place. This car will be replaced with another load exactly 1 week later. Moving north a couple miles, we can see another 0728 switch quite a coal industry. This is Pasco Iron and Metal, or PIM for short. The switch, track, and industry all got here around 2015, and now PIM receives up to 6 cars a week. In this clip from an interesting Thursday night local, we can see 2 6-axle GEs coming up to the PIM spur track to let off their conductor. A bonus on this train is that Norfolk Southern CW44-9 in the second position. Just like 0704, the Temple Terrace Rock local, the Brooksville Subdivision is a common victim of foreign power. This colorful variety of power comes out of Yeoman Yard in Tampa, shipped south on unit ethanol trains. From Union Pacific to Canadian visitors, Brooksville has seen it all. This line may see even more foreign power in the near future as a result of Tampa now receiving grain trains off the BNSF Railway. But all we can do is wait and see. Easing past 84 Lumber and a window company that receives plastic pellet cars, we move to probably the most important reason why this trackage is still in place, the CEMEX Brooksville Quarry. Here at milepost S795.1, we can see an empty coal train U482 exiting the plant over a railroad diamond. This is the Florida crushed stone loop track. Here at the south end, we can see our coal train now exiting onto the main line. Every few months, a coal drag of 30 to 40 coal cars is sent up here to Brooksville, although it's rare to see this move in daylight. This is the same industry track that 0728, our tri-weekly local, uses. With an ex-Reading Jeep 39-2, we can see a Saturday switcher shove a couple of cement hoppers into the plant. All those hoppers we're always seeing are all destined for right here. Between the usual delivery of 40 cement hoppers a week and the occasional coal train, the Brooksville Quarry is one interesting industry. But even rarer than these coal drags or locals in good light are these trains of rock. Within the Brooksville Quarry in the cement plant is Florida crushed stone, and every so often they get a few cars a week of loaded gondolas of fine white rock. But back when Brooksville would see only 1 train a week, we'd get these. Identified as K929s, these used to be unit trains of rock gondolas to Brooksville. The last time this line carried one of these was 2018, but Florida crushed stone still regularly sees over 10 cars a week, now transported by 0728. Who knows if these customers will ever demand unit trains again, but the way CSX maintains the track from Tampa to Brooksville, there still might be a chance. Again, we'll just have to wait and see. Northbound 4 miles and we've reached the end of track markers. Here in Brocco, the CEMEX North Brooksville cement plant resides, along with Vulcan Materials. Although not as busy as it used to be, this end-of-the-line industry still receives about 10 cars a week. More hoppers coming in and out of here is a good sight, yet the Florida crushed stone plant 4 miles to the south still gets the majority of the traffic. But in November of 2020, CSX sent a Herzog ballast train and a few track crews down to CEMEX, and 1 month later the small North Hammock Yard was rebuilt. This surprised us rail fans, as obviously the CEMEX plant needs more storage area, or they need more yard trackage for their yard switcher to handle the cuts of hoppers destined for the unloader. Originally built in 1936, Seaboard's Hammock Yard was pulled up when the line from North Brooksville to Waldo was abandoned in the 1970s. Now if hoppers are blocking the Camp Mine loop track, engines can run around their trains in Hammock. Even with the abolition of PSR and the recovery of COVID-19, the Brooksville sub still has some industry, and as long as that is profitable for CSX, trains will still run. This line has already been offered to the city of Tampa twice from CSX to use as commuter passenger rail systems, along with the Clearwater sub. But that was back in 2015, and it's been 6 years without a peep from the committee. I hope you found this video interesting, or you learned some new facts. The Brooksville sub's history is definitely underrated, and the special movements we get on this are not common for other lines. So on behalf of Brooksville sub rail fans, I hope the best for this line. Even if it does become commuter rail or is abandoned, I think the Seaboard would still be proud of it. So until we meet again on the Brooksville sub or anywhere on the high iron, this is CSX 101, the Brooksville Subdivision, end of transmission.